In this lecture, we'll talk about the growing unrest in the Spanish colonies, and we will also need to understand what was happening in the world at the time because that has a great effect on what was happening in the very late 1700s and in the early 1800s in Spanish colonial Mexico, which of course has a big effect on Texas history itself. So let's go ahead and dig in and talk about what was happening in the world in the late 1700s. So essentially, one thing that was happening, of course, was in 1776, United States gets its independence from Great Britain. Okay, and they create a treaty in 1783, and that's where the boundaries were set in the new United States. Constitution was created in 1787, and in the world, the French Revolution, of course, was happening in the late 1700s, inspired partially by the United States independence movement. Now, this has a growing concern for Spanish colonial authorities, and really it was because of the fact that the Americans they were concerned were going to encroach on Spanish territory. And so this new independent United States does have an effect on what Spanish authorities are concerned about. So what was happening in the Spanish colonies at that time? So interestingly enough, at that time in the Spanish colonies, they were still seeing issues with indigenous peoples, and they will through the 1870s, even after Spanish control is over. But we do start to see the numbers of Indians in East Texas begin to dwindle, mainly because of disease, because of conquest, both by other indigenous groups like the Comanches and the Apaches, but also because of encroachment from settlers. Um, Now, in Spanish Louisiana, they start to allow Protestant families to come in and settle there, and mainly because they were concerned again about that, encroachment of Americans beginning to push a little bit more westward. In 1795, there was a formal treaty known as Pinckney's Treaty in the United States, but it was a Treaty of San Lorenzo to the Spanish. And essentially, what this did was it gave navigation rights to, American commercialmen that wanted to travel down the Mississippi and they wanted to use the port of New Orleans. And so this allowed them to get navigation rights without giving them territory. So this seemed to be, a good way to control the threat of American encroachment. The one thing there's a couple things that really are an issue to the Spanish and to the Americans. And that was indigenous threat on both sides. And so this treaty also made a promise that it would try to keep the indigenous people that were under their control at that time in control, although I'm not really sure how they would have done that. But the other issue is slavery. Okay, at this point, and it's going to be a little later, that the Spanish actually completely get rid of slavery, just a little bit after it. But essentially, what Spanish authorities said and the Pope said was that if people of African descent, want to become Spanish citizens and be free from slavery, all they had to do was to accept the true faith, which was Catholicism at the time. And so we saw a lot of slaves, travel down to Florida. There was a really famous one in the 1730s known as Stono Rebellion. But this begins to really happen, and they travel down and make a trek down to Spain to become free. And so, of course, Americans didn't like this. Their slaves were running away. In this next slide, I'm going to show you a link to a PBS clip on what they called the first Underground Railroad, in which slaves are making the trek down to Spanish Florida to become free. So here's the clip on that, and there's a link. It should be in the PowerPoint for you, and I will also put the video in your module on this as well. Okay, the other thing that begins to happen, and this has a huge effect on Mexican history, and it really leads to Mexican independence, was the rise of Napoleon. Okay, so you might remember from a couple slides, I mentioned the French Revolution, right? So the French Revolution, they get rid of their monarch. The Reign of Terror happens. They chop off King Louis and Marie Antoinette's head. And so they're free, right? Except now they left themselves vulnerable to other outsiders that are going to come about. One of their biggest concerns was that Great Britain would come try to take them over and they would be weak. So this led to the very quick rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a military commander. And he eventually declares himself as the emperor as well. Um, but when Napoleon becomes the leader, he's from the beginning making great strides and conquering much area in Europe. He forces Spain to give back that territory that they lost during the French and Indian War, the Louisiana area. Okay, so he kind of forces them to give them back to them. Now, this concerns Americans greatly. This concerns Americans because if you remember from a couple of slides ago, I just mentioned the fact that Pinckney's treaty gave them the area navigation rights down the Mississippi and also the port of New Orleans. So Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, sends an envoy to go to France to say, hey, can we get can we have a little bit of control of this territory again? And they were willing, and he authorized them to give him some money for those trading and navigation rights now that it was under French control. But to Thomas Jefferson's great surprise and glee, they were willing to offer the entire thing for 15 million. There's a couple reasons for this, okay? Napoleon was running out of money, and so he needed the money. He also realized that trying to control this territory this far away that was really uncharted, not known very well, was not good for business, wasn't going to help him because he's more concerned about conquering Europe. And so he sells the whole shebang to the United States, $15 million. That's like the best real estate deal ever. It's like if you're doing the math on that, that's about 3 or 4 cents an acre. And even in that time, that was obviously extremely cheap, right? And so I'll show you an image of that. It doubles the size in the United States. It was a pretty big deal. But I do want to mention that the Napoleonic Wars, the wars that Napoleon wages on Europe over that time, lasts for 16 years, has a huge influence on the colonies, even the former colonies, even the United States. Okay, and so it's important to keep that in mind that that's happening with Napoleon at that time. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea of the vast amount of territory. This, of course, was Lewis and Clark's expedition. But this shows you this area, okay? Notice down here, these areas were disputed by Spain. In reality, the entire territory down to the Rio Grande right here was actually disputed. And Thomas Jefferson, his administration, said that, hey, I think Louisiana Purchase goes all the way down here, which, as you can imagine, the Spanish are not going to like very much at all, okay? But this new territory that the United States gained also in Spanish territory, they gained quite a bit of Anglo adventurers that begin to want to come down and settle in the area. Now, there's several of them, but a couple of them that I want to point out. One was a man named Philip Nolan. Okay, he was one of the very first adventurers to eventually land in Texas. He lived actually amongst the the Comanche for a while. After he lost his fortune, things were taken away and given back to him. He was actually an immigrant from Ireland that came to America and then eventually made his way down to Louisiana. His exploits brought kind of a lot of interest in other American frontiersmen, and that's why he's kind of important. The Spanish were suspect of him right from the beginning, okay? They thought he was a spy for sure. Nobody really knows for sure if he was really a spy or he was just kind of like, he was a horse thief. And he would essentially do a lot of things that the Comanche did, and he lived among some Comanche for a while too, was that he would steal horses and claim them for his fortune. He was killed and captured by Spanish authorities. Another man who dubbed himself the Baron of Bastrop, Felipe Enrique Neerybogel. He was actually from the Dutch Guiana in Africa. He was claimed to come from very noble Dutch birth, and he became and actually he went to Holland for a little while. And when he went to Holland, which is the Netherlands, he had to flee. Became a tax collector, but he had to flee because he was going to be charged. He was suspected of embezzlement, which is stealing funds and stealing money. He came to Louisiana in 1795, He was at first granted a settlement, then that was revoked essentially. He ended up coming to Texas, and he was Protestant, so the Catholics didn't trust him in a lot of different ways. But he does get permission to settle a town in between San Antonio and the Trinity River, which today is Bastrop, Texas, obviously named after him. Um, and he settled it from previous settlers across Texas and some from Louisiana, and Choctaw Indians settled Bastrop. He ended up leaving there and coming back actually to San Antonio area and living in San Antonio for a very long time. But yeah, that's where the name Bastrop came from. Um, so, as I mentioned before, this threat of the United States was very real. Jefferson, as I mentioned before, too, claimed that the whole land, the area all the way to the Rio Grande, was actually theirs. It was so tense between the two countries that they actually believed they were going to go to war with each other. Okay, that is until a neutral ground was settled. And you can see on this map here that the neutral ground is settled over here between the two eventually, and I think that was in 1806 that they came to terms with that. But the Spanish are going to begin to bolster their defenses in what they're posturing and what they believe was, U.S. aggression towards their land. One of the things that they do is they sent more troops to occupy Mission Valero. And that Mission Valero, of course, we know as the Alamo. And the reason it was given that name of the Alamo is because the ones that occupied it was this group called the Second Flying Company of San Carlos del Alamo de Parras. Okay, so that's where it came from the group that came to settle to protect Spain. That's where the term the Alamo comes from. Like I mentioned before, Governor Cordero, who was the governor at that time of Spanish Texas, he wanted to have more settlers come out, but he specifically forbade any Anglo settlers to come out. And that's because of their relations with Indians. They didn't really respect a lot of the treaties that were set. And so he forbade them for that reason. And they were Protestant. He didn't really trust them. So there were already settlements in La Bahia and San Antonio and Nacogdoches. But they began to settle other areas, like San Marcos, Colorado, and Guadalupe. They were eventually abandoned because in 1810, 1811, the War of Mexican Independence comes, and they're going to be resettled later on post American annexation or Texas annexation to the United States. In 1846, I think, is when San Marcos was founded. So some other things are happening in the Spanish government, and of course this is because of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon essentially forces the Spanish king to abdicate the throne. He has, King Charles and his heir Ferdinand abdicate it, meaning that give it up, and he put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne instead. Now, the instability of Spain, this kind of greatly affected the colonies in particular. The governor at that time, Manuel Salcedo, who was actually Cordero's nephew, so he succeeded him, tried to get help from the Spanish government, but really to no avail. He did establish a little bit of order in the colonies, even with the instability that was happening. He created the very first oxen cart licensing, which was kind of different, right? Different ordinances, noise ordinances, but he wasn't able to avert the growing rebellion that was really brewing in the colonies at that time, really because people began to question not only the authority that was happening with Napoleon and the instability that Napoleon was creating, but also because the caste system that was persisting, right? The inequality that was happening at that time. And so what we started to see is insurrection begin in the frontier area. And what was happening? What was beginning to cause this rage that was happening? Many causes of the Mexican independence movement were that many people were living in poverty. Many saw the church as corrupt. The church owned the majority of the property, right? And I will say, though, however, that the priests in the rural areas, they also did live in poverty too. The Bourbon reforms that were happening in Europe at that time weren't having a really big effect on the poverty that was occurring in the colonies. In addition to the poverty and the labor practices, indigenous blacks, mulattoes, they didn't receive full and equal treatment For example, a lot of the crimes were based on ethnicity. You would get a longer time for a crime than you were if you were peninsulares. Even the criollas were limited in their in comparison to peninsulares. They could own property, and a lot of them owned mines and businesses like that, but they couldn't hold anything beyond a local authority or local post. The national and provincial governments were not for them. Okay, so this kind of stirs the pot of a lot of people that were unhappy in the colonies. Juntas were formed, which were like they were like consults of government, local kind of governments deciding what to do. They also believed that Ferdinand and King Charles were actually the legitimate heirs. So they supported that as opposed to Napoleon. So they didn't like the fact that Joseph Bonaparte was ruling that area. They began to kind of plot an overthrow. Meanwhile, there was a priest by the name of Father Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo. He is known as the father of Mexican independence, although he doesn't live very long. He's assassinated a year later. He was Criolle. He was very liberal, believed in liberal reforms. He was also really influenced by the Spanish Enlightenment. Now, he makes a very impassioned speech and he rings the bell, and this is September 16th of 1810, which of course is why Spanish Independence Day, or I'm sorry, Mexican Independence Day is recognized on that date. This is what really marks the beginning of the independence movement in Mexico. Now, Governor Salcedo really does try to garner support from Tejanos and others that are and make them loyal to the crown. He doesn't have much success with this, especially when he actually sends a garrison of the troops that are sitting in San Antonio to go try to stop this insurgency and put the insurgency down. And they're really not happy about this because if they were to abandon the Presidio, they were to abandon the area, the garrison that was there, then that would leave their families vulnerable to Indian attacks. So, even amongst his soldiers, he didn't have very much support. There was also, the first real revolt that happens in Texas against Spanish authorities, and this was led by Juan Bautista de las Casas revolt. Now, it's essentially, he wasn't very successful. Casas was actually replaced by somebody else midway through it. But it does kind of shake things up. And Salcedo, he does restore order, but Texas, when it comes back, is very much on shaky grounds. Okay, so in the next lecture, I'll talk about the actual Mexican independence and the effects of that. I broke it up into 2 videos because I thought this might be a little bit too long, but hopefully that gives you a little bit more idea on what was brewing in Texas at that time during the things that led up to the Mexican Revolution.